Okay, so we are going to do a seam finish with bias binding. So bias binding is this stuff, you probably got a package of it, so it comes in yards and yards and yards of it, but I've just cut some little pieces of the bias binding, and we're going to basically do a seam finish where we use this to finish the seam. So we've got 2 pieces of prepped muslin, just like we normally do, that are 4.5 inches wide by 10 inches long, so that we can sew our seam. That'll make our 8 by 10 piece, and then we'll put the bias binding on it. And again, it should look like this. It's probably, really in a long pack, but what it is it's a piece of bias material, meaning it's been cut on the bias, which means it has a little bit of stretch to it. The point of this is that it can kind of move a little bit. It has a little stretch, kind of hard to see, but it does. It's been, instead of cut on the straight grain, like which would go in this direction, or the cross grain, it's cut at a 45-degree angle, so you have a little bit of stretch. So it's perfect to bind something off, to bind off a seam, or to bind off, we'll use it later for armholes or necklines, to give it just a little bit of stretch, but still some stability, okay? And then this is a double fold. So what that means is, see how it's been folded on itself twice? I can open it up, and I've got 2 different folds. So it's been folded over and then folded over again. You could make this yourself if you don't purchase it, but honestly for right now, it's easier just to buy a bunch of it. We'll use it later again. So we'll use only a little bit now, and then you'll save it for another project that we'll use it for. But it just does some work for you because it's already been perfectly folded and it's ready to go. And we'll show you how to do this. So the first thing we're gonna do is sew our regular 1/2 inch seam. So I'll line up my 2 pieces of muslin, and I'll pin them to be ready to sew them. So I'm going in the opposite direction. I'm gonna sew this way. So I'm gonna pin in the opposite direction so that I can easily pull those pins out, and I'm pinning on my ends and then in the middle, and that's probably enough for me, so that now I can sew at a 1/2 inch. Okay, and my machine is all prepped and ready. I've got a regular presser foot on there. I've got my thread pulled towards the back. I'm gonna line this up, starting about 1/4 of an inch from the edge, drop my presser foot, hold on to my 2 threads, and I'm gonna hand walk those first few stitches just to make sure that's in place. Then I can let go, and I could also probably pick up this needle right now, the one that was holding that down, or this pin, and then I can go ahead and sew my stitch with the foot pedal. And when I get to the pin, pick up my presser foot, take out my pin, can put it back down. And last one, take out my pin and sew the rest. Okay, complete my stitch, pull that out nice and even, and then I'll just, again, take my fingers and kind of push out this gathering that naturally tends to happen. Push it out so that it's not locked in. So I've got a 1/2 inch seam. I'll go ahead and clip my threads. Regular 1/2 inch seam, and I'm gonna go ahead and press this open. So I'll come over here to my iron, and I can just kind of finger press this by hand to start, right? And then I'll press it open from the inside with my iron, making sure I'm pressing it fully and I'm not capturing any little wrinkles. And then I'll press it from the outside as well. And really I'm just pulling, spreading apart as I go to make sure that that is fully pulled open or pressed open. So I've got a nice, neat, very flat seam. I could almost see the pucker of the stitches, okay? And I've got the inside here pressed open as well. So now that I've got my seam, I want to do my seam finish. So I'm going to get some of the bias binding, and I'm just going to measure to see that I've got enough. This one I've already cut to length. You just want it as long as your piece of muslin or as long as your seam that you're finishing with. And there's two different ways that we're going to do this. So when you've got your little piece cut, right, that's the right size. So basically you need a 10-inch piece or a little bit longer than 10-inch, and then you can always trim it down after the fact. You're going to look and notice that one side is actually shorter than the other. See how on this side I can't see the underneath piece basically, and this side I can. So what it is one side, you know, is a little bit folded, a little bit shorter, okay? So just be aware of that, that one side is longer than the other. And what we want to do is use this binding to basically place on our seam allowance, right? I'm gonna kind of sandwich it on there and show you, so that it would be bound, so I wouldn't see that fray that I see right here. And you see this a lot. You see it in couture finishes and really high-end finishes, and you also see it in less expensive sort of commercial things, because it's a simple way to finish the edges of, say, the inside of something. Like if you didn't want to give a lining to a jacket or lining to something, you could do this as a edge finish, a seam finish to the inside of your seam. So I see it in all sorts of applications. It can be done by hand in a really delicate way, in a really couture way, or it can be done in sort of industrial settings in a commercial way, even for like fast fashion from Forever 21 or something like that. So you see it in lots of applications. And this way, again, you'd have this bound edge, you wouldn't have any fray, it would look really nice. Sometimes the binding is in a contrast color, and it's kind of fun, and it's a design feature. So a way that we can do this is to literally just take it as it is, just open it one time, right? So it's double turned on itself, and we can just sandwich our seam, or one half of our seam. Right now we're going to do two different types, one on each side, okay? So let's just take one side of our inside seam allowance, okay? So I'm making sure, whoops, not to grab this piece. I don't want you to see anything on the outside. So I'm just grabbing this little 1/2-inch piece, right? And I can sandwich it inside this folded bias binding. And imagine now if I sew this, well, it's all closed up, right? It's all sealed, there's no fray, looks really nice, okay? So that's what I'm gonna do to start with on one side. And what I wanna make sure that I do is make sure that the longer side, the side that pokes out just a little bit, see how that's poking out from the bottom, that's underneath, because that way when I fold it and I sew on top very close to this edge, it'll make sure to catch this piece of fabric underneath, because this piece of fabric underneath is actually longer, right? If I did this the other way around, and I just see this happen all the time when students do this, say I use the shorter piece underneath and then I sew like this, what's going to happen is I'm going to sew really close to the edge here, and I won't have even caught it at all here. It'll just flop right off. The whole point of it will be lost. Okay, so this is an easier, super easy, almost like cheat method to do this, and then I'll do a more involved method on the other side. But this is like the super easy way. It's just to sandwich it, just making sure that the longer side is underneath. So I am going to basically push my seam allowance as far into that fold as I can, okay? So see how I'm doing that? I'm really making sure it's all the way over. And then I'll start taking my pins and pinning it down. So I'm gonna go all the way down, really making sure it's nice and straight and all the way tucked in my little sandwich. You could also hand baste this instead of doing the pins, or you could pin first and then hand baste it. But I'm gonna see if this is enough and I could get it locked in place where I want. And notice how it's almost coming over to touch that inside seam, but not quite. That's what I want. I obviously wouldn't want it to go over the seam because I don't want us to see anything from the outside of the garment. I want this to just be hidden on the inside. But I do want it to look nice and neat and straight from the inside so that it could almost be like a design feature as well. And I'm going all the way down to the bottom, really taking my time to pin it fully so that it doesn't move while I try to sew it all the way down. Okay, and then I could always test this right before I sew and lock it in place. See if I can open this back up. My pieces are sticking together. There we go. So I'm just gonna kind of finger press this back down. But the idea is now from the front, from the outside, I shouldn't see any pins. I shouldn't see that I've accidentally captured anything in there, right? Which I don't. Looks really good. You can imagine if my pins are out of the way. So this would be, I've just captured just this half of the seam allowance, okay? Now here's the issue, is that all my pins are like facing, you know, in this direction, the same way that I'm about to sew. So this is why I say if you want, you can hand baste this to lock it in place, and then you can remove these pins to get them out of your way. Or you can attempt to sew like this. You'll just have to be pulling the pins out constantly as you go. You could also take the pins, maybe even after you've pinned them in that direction, to really get it right and see if you can turn them this way. It's just such a small space, it can be kind of difficult to pin it going in this direction, but I'll see if I can give it a try without kind of messing up how neat and straight my pinning was. Let's see if I can do this. It's kind of moving a little bit, you know, it's kind of shifting on me. I don't like it. I'm gonna go back this direction. I feel like that's solidly keeping it where I want to be. Again, when in doubt, if it's not doing what you want to do, hand baste and take your time and hand baste well, and then you could always sew on top and you know it'll be good. But I'm gonna try to sew this now like this. I'm gonna see what happens. And I'm gonna sew very close to this edge, as close as I can get, okay? Because what I want to do is capture all the thicknesses, right? So that I've captured this in, and I don't want a lot of this material to be able to flap around, okay? So I could, I mean, I've got lots of space. I could sew like in the middle. I don't want to. I really want to sew as close to this end as possible. So that's going to be my goal. So come over to my machine. See if I can get us a little bit closer. And again, I'm going to start from about 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch, somewhere in there from the edge. And I'm just going to line that needle up so it is like really, really, really close, you know, a little 1/16 of an inch from the edge of my binding tape. And I am hand walking those first few stitches, making sure that they're locked in place. Go ahead and pull that first pin out. Again, I mean, you could sit here and I could hand walk the entire thing. No shame. Or I can turn this on and see if I can do the rest of the seam. I'm getting close to this next pin, so I'll just pull that out now. And as I get close to these other pins, I'm just going to make sure I pull those out before I get anywhere near them. I always try to make sure my needle is down before I pull out a pin or do anything that's going to slightly shift what I'm sewing. So nice and slow and steady for accuracy. And again, this is a seam finish. It's a way to finish your inside edges to make it look nice and neat. And if you did a contrast color, it would even be easier to see. I feel like I'm running into, it's kind of difficult to see where my edge is, but let's see if I got it. So pick my presser foot up, clip that, and here's my moment of truth. You can see I've gotten very, very close to this edge. I could check the other side, and here's where I really want to make sure that I caught it, you know, that look, I've only got this little bit that's coming up. I've caught it all the way down, and then you can even see the line from my previous seam. So I can open this up, and gorgeous. I don't see anything from the front. This is the outside. It looks really good. And from the inside, I would have this lovely bound edge, right? And so I could press this open, just make sure it lies nice and flat. Looks really good. Press it again from the outside. It definitely thickens the seam a little bit. That's why it works really well for like a jacket or maybe pants or skirt, something like that. If it was really delicate, this would add a lot of bulk, like, you know, if you were doing a top or something. But works really well. It's very similar in this regard to a French seam where you have this kind of little flap of a seam, but it's totally finished on the inside. So really, really simple way to do that. So for the other side, let me make sure I don't need to clip anything that's in my way. There we go. For the other side, we're still going to use some bias binding, but we're going to do it in a slightly different way. This is going to mirror more what we would do if we were using binding to finish off an armhole or a neck hole or something like that. So we're going to sew an open flap of the bias binding to the other side of our seam allowance. Again, just the seam allowance. We're not going through the outside of the fabric. We're going to sew these two pieces together, then wrap this around, and then we're going to stitch this down, which is what we would do, again, if we were doing binding on the edge of a raw edge of the outside, something like that. Okay, so it's going to be similar, just a slightly different process, and then it'll look a little bit different in the end. Okay, so what I want you to do is, same as before, I want you to pay attention to which side is the smaller side and which side is the longer side. Okay, so I want you to take your shorter side, right, so this side here, and open it up in half, and I want you to pin the edge of this fold to the edge of your seam allowance. And you can do it in this direction, you can do it in a long direction, whatever way feels better for you, knowing that you might have to remove the pins as you go. But see how I'm putting the edge of this fold, see how it's open in half, shorter side on this side, and I'm lining it up with the edge of just my seam allowance, just one side of my seam allowance. The main part of the fabric is over there, untouched. I'm going to pin this all the way down. So almost there. Pin it all the way. Oh, and this piece is extra long. I can trim that now, or I can trim that later. I've lined it up on the edge down here, but maybe just even to get this out of the way, I can trim that right now. Sometimes when I am doing an armhole binding or a neck hole binding, I leave it extra long because I might need that extra piece to kind of fold inside, something like that. But in this case, we can just get rid of it. Okay, so you can see I've got these two pinned together evenly. I am not going into the outside. I see nothing on the outside. It's just going to look like this, okay? And it's opened up. So what I'm going to do is now sew this together, Okay, I'm gonna sew the seam allowance and just half of the bias binding. And you can sew at about a 1/2 inch over, but what you want to make sure that you don't do is sew so far that you go past your original seam line, okay? So to give myself a guide, what I can do is just sew. I'm going to show you with the pin so you can really see. I'm going to sew right here, kind of right past where this folded flap is, okay? So not quite into the middle of the fold. I think that'll be a little too far. That'll be about on my original seam. So I want to sew in this area, between the fold, between this fold line and between where this flap is, okay? So just right there. This is my goal, okay? So I'm going to sew straight down in that place, sewing into that fold if I can. If I can see it. So I'll put the needle down, presser foot down. I'm holding on to those first few threads. I'm going to walk those first few stitches, make sure I've got it locked in, pull this pin out of the way. Let me see if I can bring you a little closer. And I'll go ahead and sew my seam. Pulling these pins out as I go. And really always making sure, like I kind of am always checking underneath, that you haven't accidentally pulled some of your fabric in under your seam. You really want to make sure that you're only sewing what you mean to sew. So at any point when the needle's down, you know, you could always raise this, take your hand and kind of push the fabric underneath. Let's hope for the best that I haven't caught any fabric. But that is a common mistake that happens. Okay, so all done. Pull that out. And let's open it up and double check. Okay, from the outside, this is actually a really good example. You can see, let me see what happened. Let's see, that's the previous one I did. This is this new one. So look and see, this is what I'm talking about. And I was being so careful. But see how I accidentally, I mean barely, I caught some of the outside fabric with that stitch, even though, look, it wasn't on the line, it was a little bit in, but because it was just folded a little, it caught it. It caught it here and it caught it here. I don't want to see that, and it actually did it up there too. I don't want to see any of that. So even as careful as I was being, and you can see what happened here, it just caught it. There's little bits of fold. So I actually want to pull this out and do that again. It's a good exercise to show you that I can't really continue. So I can try, see if I can just pull this out, but might have to get a seam ripper and pull this seam out, or I can try to just pull out my bias binding like this. Whew, kind of made a mess of it. And I can pick these extra bits away. If this gets really gnarled up and wrinkled, I can re-press it, just making sure that I don't lose the folds, you know, that were already created in there. And I'm pulling out all the little bits. Okay, so this, I haven't messed this up too terribly bad, but you could always refold that if you need to. And now I'm going to go here and make sure I pull out anything extra. Don't be afraid to pull it out and start over and get it right. So I just really need to make sure when I do that again that I've got that just in the right place. So one more time. What was it? Yes, I took the smaller side, open it up, and I'm going to pin these sides together. Whew, and I am just going to really have to make sure that I am keeping that fabric super open. What I might even do really quickly, since that happened, is go ahead and press this open, because see how just this tiny bit is trying to curl up, you know, towards my seam? If I can press this open, I could probably prevent that from happening. this next time. So I'm just hitting this with the iron. I'm going to try to set myself up for success. And the steam is coming out. Whew. See if I can not make the same mistake twice. So again, smaller side. Oh, I already had a pin in there. Start it here. Let me see if I pin long ways this time, if it's better or worse for me. And keep pinning all the way down. Again, maybe a hand-based would help so that I could, check before I hit it on the machine if it's in the right spot. Okay, we'll try this once more, and my goal is not to let even the tiniest bit of this fabric come over here. So what I'm probably really going to try to do is err more on the side of sewing closer to this side than I am that side. Okay? Oh, my pressed foot came off. Okay, so one more time. Let's see if I can do this. Start with those first few stitches walking. And again, as I sew now, I'm going to be hyper aware of pushing my underneath fabric with my hand so that I don't get any folds. It's like every so often I'm going to make sure my needle's down and I'm double and triple checking. What's the expression? Like, fool me once, but you can't fool me twice. Now I'm like on a high alert. And again, I try not to pull my fabric up unless my needle is down. Give me some extra security, but I'm just checking as I go. Okay, finish that seam, press your foot up. Let's see, looks good from this side. And yes, much better from this side. See how I have completely cleared the seam this time? I think that's residual, but I've really come farther away from it this time. And I don't see any pricks from the front this time. So very good. I'm happy with myself. A little bit better. Okay. So I've got it connected here, and I've really aimed closer to this side when I've sewn. So what I'm going to do now is open this up, wrap it around this seam like this, kind of sandwiching it in there, right? See how I've done that? And let me open this up. So what I'm going to do is fold this down, and this seam is going to be a little bit like a flat felled seam. So rather than having this flappy bit like the French seam where it's a finished seam that flaps, this finished seam allowance is actually going to be held down to the fabric, okay? And we can do it two ways, and I'm going to do both and show you how to do both, and I want you to do both. So we can do a top stitch very close to this edge, so you'll see it from the outside. You'll see that top stitch, very similar to a flat felled seam. And then about halfway through from the other side, I'm going to do a slip stitch, so it'll be a little bit more invisible, okay? So the first thing I want to do, just to set myself up, is I'm going to press this really nicely so that when I go to sew it, it's not moving all around on me. So I'm just pressing it exactly flat as it lays, but it's just starting to move a little bit, so I just want to make sure it's not moving. And I could hit it from the front again as well, just to make sure I don't capture any wrinkles in there. Okay, so you can come down and mark a place, but we can just eyeball about halfway. I'll go ahead and put a pin about halfway through. I'm putting it through all the thicknesses, like so I even see it from the underside. And I'm going to sew through all the layers, so I'll see it on the front, very close to this edge, and do like a top stitch, again similar to a flat fell seam, that goes about down to my pin, about halfway. So I'll set this up. I'm really trying to put my needle down very close to that edge. And I'm going to walk those first few stitches, walk the whole thing if you need to. I'll pull this up. Okay. And I have sewn very, 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 very close to this edge, so it's locking it down. And from this side, again, very similar, let me just push some of that tension out, very similar to a flat felled seam, where I've got my seam here and it's almost like a top stitch on the side that's holding it down, okay? So that would be how I would do a bound edge with a machine stitch, okay? And so to finish this, I'll trim that. And just because we're going to do a different stitch on the other side, we'll practice our little trick where we can pull this towards the inside. So see how I pull that till I get the little loop here. And then again, I can use a pin. And what I'm trying to do is pull both sides of the thread to one side, so that, look, from the outside it just stops, looks really nice and neat. And from this side I can tie a double knot so that it doesn't come undone. And then I can trim this like 1/4 of an inch. Okay, and so for the rest of it, I also want to lock it in place, but I'll go ahead and do a hand slip stitch. So I'll take some needle and thread, and I'll go ahead and double the thread. So remember what that means is that I'm pulling it 2 times through, right? So I've got 2 threads, and then it's sort of like dangling my needle like a necklace. And then I'm going to tie a double knot on the end so it doesn't come out. Okay, so just like that, a knot on itself, and then I'll do it again, slipping that down. Oh, and if this happens, like, see, I didn't get the knots in the same place, usually one more time and I can connect the two or pick one. There we go. So I got double knot there. Trim my excess. And here I can do a slip stitch. And if you remember how to do a slip stitch, right? This is where we're going to sew in the fold here, and we'll only do a little prick that shows up on the outside. So in this case, I can go into the fold of my bias binding to hide my first knot, and then I can come right over to the outside fabric, get like 1 or 2 pieces of thread, and then come right back over, and I'm sliding my needle into the fold, right, so that it comes up about a 1/2 inch over out of the fold, and you don't see any thread except those little picks on the outside. And again, if this was in a matching color, you would never see it at all. So again, I'm coming in and I'm sliding my needle along the fold of that bias binding. Oops. And I'm giving just a little pick of 1 or 2 threads, see, on the outside. And from here, all you see are these little picks, okay? But it's going to do the same basic thing in that it's going to lock this down similar to a flat felled seam. And it's going to be a great way to finish off our edges later when we do armholes and neck holes. And I'm going to finish this. Oops, make sure to slide that along. Basically until I get up here to where I stopped with my machine stitch. Alright, so again, it looks like this from here, just these tiny little picks. I don't see any of the thread because it's hidden within the fold. And then on the outside, I just see these little picks, okay? So I'm about to run out of thread, and, so I won't finish there. I can almost finish, but then when you get to the end, you're also going to tie off a little knot similar. So I want yours to meet. Let me see if I can get mine to meet. I'll do just a little bit more. Might be able to make it meet. I just went a little too short when I got my thread. I think it could work. I would just have a tiny, tiny knot to tie when I get to the end. Oh, so close. But I want you to go ahead and finish it so they connect, okay? So you've got one side that is slip stitched down and one side that is machine sewn down. And this finished seam allowance is totally stuck down to the fabric, unlike this side, which flaps around, okay? And then when you're all done, you can press this, so it'll look like this from the front, but it'll be really nice and neat and pressed, okay? So one side won't have anything, the other side will have this half top stitch and a half little prick that you'll see here, okay?